Welcome to the Highland Heights Sunday morning Bible class. We are glad that you are joining us. We are continuing to have these online conversations as long as we have to. Of course, we say this every week. We hope to be back together in person for Bible classes on Sunday morning. If you haven't already joined us and you're able, we have restarted the Sunday night family groups, this meeting together on Sunday nights, where we hope that you're joining for those. And we hope that soon what we're doing here will not be necessary because we'll be in person on Sunday mornings. But until then, we will continue on. So, Jeremy, we are coming up to the last lesson in our, or last conversation, I should say, in our series on apologetics. If you haven't been with us up to this point, you can go back on YouTube and go to maybe any of the individual lessons that sound interesting, maybe questions that you've heard from non-believers, family members, different people, maybe questions you've had yourselves. Those are all available to go back and look at. But this week we are going to conclude with asking one of the big questions. So let's say you're having ongoing conversations with a non-believer, someone at work, a friend, a family member, and you go through all of the different questions that they have, but they still have more. And oftentimes someone will come to the Christian, they'll come to you and they'll say, I still have more questions, and therefore I can't believe. Therefore, I can't follow God because I haven't answered all of the questions that I want to put forward. We'll probably talk more about personal examples here later on, but Jeremy, how do I react to this? How do I react to someone who says, I can't become a Christian because I have too many questions?
Well, it's important to remember as we consider this idea of doubt and of questions that faith is not an instant thing. It's not like you flip a switch. Faith grows. It's a process. One of my favorite examples is Abraham was 75 years old when God first called him. He was 100 when Isaac was born. We think Isaac was 15 when God said, okay, go sacrifice him on Mount Moriah. That doesn't take long to read, but that's 40 years.
Yeah.
Okay? That's a long journey of faith. Okay. I used to be able to say that, neither person in this conversation has even lived that long to have an idea of how long 40 years is, but it's not true anymore. So when we come to this idea, we need to remember that it takes time, it takes work, it takes effort. And it might be a situation where someone is saying, I still have questions. I still have things that I want answers to because they're still processing what they've learned. It takes time to move from what we've always thought to new thoughts, to change, to grow, to develop. The other thing to remember, though, is Christianity is about commitment to God. Mm-hmm. And one of the most important aspects about faith is one of the things we've seen is throughout this conversation is we have offered some answers, some reasons. We've given reasons for the hope that is within us. But they're not dispositive. They're not absolute. They're not God parting the heavens, reaching down and saying, yo, here I am. Look at me up here. Okay. The evidence is corroborative. It comes together to build a case. Okay. So when we think about this idea of corroborative evidence, it's going to take time. It's going to take work, and it's going to take trust. It's going to take trust to look at God and say, God, I see the corroboration. I'm willing to trust you. And I'm willing to say, God, I'm giving my life to you, even though I don't have all the answers. Or maybe, God, I'm giving my life to you because I don't have all the answers, but I trust that you do. Okay. So there's myriad reasons. There's myriad causes people might say, I just don't know, or I have more questions. That's okay. People have become Christians with questions in the past. 1 Corinthians, it talks about, Paul has his discourse on meat sacrificed to idols, and without getting into unpacking all of that and why he gives yes, no, maybe, and all the different answers and stuff like that, one of the subtext is some of the Corinthian Christians are still having trouble with monotheism. And Paul calls them brothers and sisters. If there were Christians in Corinth in the first century who were having trouble with monotheism, but Paul is calling them brother. It's probably okay to take some of our doubts before God as well.
I think for us as Christians, we sometimes don't do the best job of inviting others in to that end. That we don't, we have very set limits on what it means to be a Christian, and therefore we're not inviting to those who don't fit currently under those different rule sets, the different descriptions that we have in our mind. Once someone fits that description, we're very quick to invite them in. That said, throughout Christian history, and not only recorded in the New Testament, but for most of Christian history, there is a long tradition of people responding to one message, to one sermon, or to one conversation, and immediately giving over their lives. Did they know everything instantly? Absolutely not. There's almost no way they possibly could have. And it's kind of arrogant for me to say that because I don't know everything. I think that we as mature Christians, or at least we've been in it for a while, we should be upfront with our it could be doubts, it might not be, but also just lack of knowledge, that we don't know everything, that we as Christians individually and as a body still think, we are thinking people that are coming into relationship with God because it is an ongoing relationship. One other way of thinking about this that I will offer, it takes an arrogant young person to say, I know, I love everything about this person, therefore I'm going to marry them. Wait a second. For those of us who have been married for any amount of time, and certainly I'm still on the young side of marriages, especially at Highland, you know very little about the person when you marry them. And over the course of time, that knowledge builds and builds and builds. And what would there be if you had to have all the answers before you entered into relationship with someone? So just like Christ in the church are married to each other, we as God's church enter into a relationship where we grow over time, and emphasizing that growth and that it doesn't have to happen before conversion is fundamental. It's part of the Christian story.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And one of the things I think would help is for both ourselves, because there are Christians who have questions about these things. There are Christians who read, will go read and study and go, wait a minute, I've never heard this before. Okay. And there are outsiders, skeptics who are saying, okay, I hear your evidence, but it's important to remember that, the Bible is full of people that doubt too. Mm-hmm. Abraham doubted, and Abraham fell short. David doubted. It's interesting. David reigned over Israel for like 40 years, according to the Bible. So he had a good long life. Okay, that if he was able to have a reign of 40 years, and we don't actually have that much narrative about the life of David in 2 Samuel and 1st and 2nd Chronicles. But then you go to the Psalms, and that opens up a whole new world about who David was. And here's this man who is lauded as the man after God's own heart. He's still a young man, and he looks out at the giant and says, you know what? He's insulting God. I'm going to go take him out. Okay. And then you go to the Psalms, and like a third of the Psalms are what we call lament Psalms, where the author of the Psalms is saying, God, I don't understand what's going on here. I don't get it. God, why am I being mistreated? God, why is the world the way it is? We've talked about the problem of evil and suffering from multiple different angles over the course of these conversations. The lament Psalms are full of those types of questions. And this is the man after God's own heart. Peter was not there all the way. And I'm not talking about the doofus that runs around after Jesus in the Gospels. Okay. Remember in Galatians where Paul has to call Peter out to his face because Peter wasn't all the way there on the whole Gentile question. He didn't have all the answers. God basically had to drag Peter kicking and screaming to Cornelius. Peter.
And then Peter says later in his own letters, this is, what Paul says is hard.
It's hard, exactly. Yeah. That always makes me feel better when I'm having trouble exegeting a passage, because it's like, okay, I have trouble with Paul. So did Peter. So it's okay. So the Bible is full of people who say, I believe, help my unbelief. Okay. Mm-hmm. They struggled. When doubts came, they took them to God. And that's an important idea here of when we face struggles, when we face questions, when we face concerns, what do we do with them? Where do we take them? I think sometimes we think, or we give the impression that we can only go to God if we've got it all together. And we've got to get ourselves together, and then we can go to God. There's nothing could be further from the truth. Okay. Nothing could be further from the truth of our relationship with God. When we have concerns, when we have questions, when we have doubts, we should take them to God. Okay. Mm-hmm. God is a big God. I think sometimes we're afraid of asking impertinent questions. It's okay to go to God and say, God, I don't understand this. And God, I don't like this. Now, when we start telling God how he should do his job, okay, now we're getting into some impertinence here. But when we go to God and say, God, I don't get this. God's a big God. He can take it. And not only can he take it, he wants to take it. He wants us to bring these questions to him, because I'll often tell my students, guys, look, you are not going to offend me by asking me questions. You're not going to offend me by saying, Mr. Anguish, I don't think you're right. Can you please explain that in light of this? Okay. But you have to ask me, because I can't answer your question if you don't ask me. Now, does God know our questions? Yes. But going to God says to God, God, I have these questions, but I trust you to answer them. And there's that trust word again. It's that willingness to go to God and say, I don't see how this works, but I trust you to show me.
Yeah. Kind of bridging this idea of biblical example, Jesus himself questioned whether or not the need for his own pain and suffering was necessary. Now, of course, Jesus was fully submitted to the will of God the Father. And we could talk about this, subordination within the Trinity, that Jesus himself had put himself under the will of God and was willing to do what God the Father saw necessary to make salvation happen. But he wasn't happy about it. There was when we read the Gospels, we read about the way that Jesus wrestles with God. God always commends people for wrestling with him. Sometimes we misread Job. We misread it to say, oh, you shouldn't question God because of the way that God responds to Job at the end. God's putting Job in his place, but he's not saying, let's not talk. He wants that relationship. That's the beginning of the book, that God has a strong relationship with Job. We think about Jacob become Israel. Wrestling with God is what he is striving for. David, who you've already mentioned, that he was a man after God's own heart. We should be people that wrestle with God, that come after God and do not let go. That's the example that is set up for us. And so you've already got us into this idea of having a big God that is ready for our questions. And one of the things that we know here is that God is above truth. Truth is in service of God. And I'm not saying that that if truth disagrees with God, we go with God. No. Truth will never disagree with God. It is because he is reality. We should know that eventually truth will lead us to God if we are understanding it correctly. So we are open for people who accept Jesus, who accept God, but at the same time have questions about what it means to live in this world. We could bring up questions of science or questions of morality, questions of justice. We know that in God we find those answers. It doesn't necessarily mean that we as Christians, and I'll just speak for me and Jeremy, maybe I can speak for you, we don't necessarily already have the answers. So it could be that there's something that we don't know that we need to properly incorporate into the truth that is God. That said, we do go to God as our source, as the ultimate arbitrator of what is real, what is true. So having a big God allows for that to happen. I'm trying to think, what are other ways that God can be allowed into this? I'm not sure where the best place to share this is. A real quick story. I think I've shared this with some of our men's groups before. I had a friend of mine that we had conversations about faith for a while, and eventually he opened up and let me know that what was keeping him away, and he had grown up as a Christian, so for him, he considered it returning to his faith, was this question right here. I don't believe. I haven't had the experience, that call from God. So he believed in God, but he didn't believe that he was ready for it, that his life wasn't ready for it. That to me is that small view of God, a God that's not already active in his life. And for those of us who encounter these people who are always dragging their feet, one of the questions I want to ask is, what's holding you back? How is God not already moving you towards him? And if you're not willing to acknowledge him, he's already said that he will bring you in. You just have to accept that. Anyway, I'm wondering what other space do we have here for thinking about how we conceptualize God, and then how we need to grow as well.
Well, the idea of growth, growing faith. We need to remember, faith, like you've alluded to, faith is a choice that we make to seek out God. Faith is something where we're not going to find if we don't look. Okay, we have to be willing to say, okay, God, I want you. And you think about it, look, there are any number of reasons why people hesitate. Look, and let's be careful exactly how we frame this, because we don't want to frame this as dishonesty. But there are sometimes unacknowledged reasons why people don't want to acknowledge. This is a relatively simple example, but I heard a story of a young man that went to a Christian school, and a couple of the teachers were talking, discussing different things going on, and one of the teachers said, well, that so and so is an atheist, and the other teacher said, no, he's not. And well, what do you mean? He says he is. Well, yeah, he says he is. He says he's an atheist because he goes to a Christian school, and so he's doing the opposite of what's expected. And he just wants to raise questions. Okay. And that it wasn't dishonesty so much, because as much as there was a reason, but the reason was buried under some other things. There are often experiential reasons. So there are intellectual questions, but there are experiential reasons as well. People who say, I see all these Christians who say they've experienced God. I never have, not like that. Or people who have personal history. You just think about one example, people who have had very, very bad experiences with parents, and the Bible presents God as a parental figure. Well, that's going to be really hard for someone to accept God as a parental figure when all of their experience with a parental figure is bad. Example I think of is the Harry Potter books. Just without going too deeply into the plot, that poor Harry he's raised by an aunt and uncle that hate him, and he goes to school and his teachers don't listen to him. And so when he goes off to wizarding school to Hogwarts, he never goes to the teachers when any of these problems crop up. And the reason he doesn't is he's never had an authority figure he could trust. I mean, it's a very logical narrative choice that J.K. Rowling made. Okay.
Yeah, now we'll have to put a marker on this, explicit with witchcraft. So sorry to the audience.
Witchcraft and wizardry, yeah. So we need to make sure when we're talking to people who have concerns that we're digging into, okay, what's driving this? What's motivating this? Okay. And we need to meet people where they are. And again, I'm not saying that people are dishonest. Okay. People are complex and they're complicated.
Mm-hmm.
And people do things for multiple reasons. Some of them good, some of them straightforward reasons, some of them less straightforward, and some of them maybe even unacknowledged. So we need to make sure that we are giving people time and taking the time, and even within ourselves, taking the time to unpack, okay, why am I saying what I'm saying? Why am I doing what I'm doing? And then once we've kind of unblocked that and gotten into that, okay, now we can start going to God with our own personal honesty and saying, God, here is what's holding me back. Because then God can say, okay, all right, now we can deal with this.
Right.
Now, okay, I am here to help you deal with this now that we know what all is going on. We need to make sure we know the whys and wherefores.
So one reaction that I'll give to some of the things that you've brought up here is I think that Wayne and Kelly and Stan probably would know that on you have a different sermon on Sunday morning than you might have it on Sunday night. And even then, if I went up to Wayne before his sermon on a Sunday morning and said, by the way, I brought a visitor with me today, they don't know the gospel. You can imagine that there's going to be a few changes made in the way that Wayne presents the message. Not a change in the message itself, but a change in the way to be, to use the Willow Creek language, seeker sensitive, to be aware of the way that we talk about the Christian faith for someone who's seeking it out, knowing that they might have these preconceived notions about what Christianity is, and some of those might be wrong. So part of the message might be trying to address those. In a Bible class, if one of us were teaching Jeremy and we saw someone in the audience who we either don't know or we didn't know if they were a Christian, you might try to just do a little bit of a different spin on the message to make sure that you're reaching these people that are not going to have, you might not have that many opportunities to share. I say that to say this, though, that for most of us in a workplace or a family setting, we're around those people a lot. And so from the very beginning, from step one with these people, the way that we present the gospel should be seeker sensitive, meaning that we don't present the gospel in a way that makes sense to us. We present the gospel in a way that goes directly to their issues and seeks to answer their questions, rather than presenting something that we think is plainly obvious. Acknowledging that their questions are real, that their concerns are should be taken seriously, even if we don't think that they're right or have the amount of merit that they think that they have. We should respect them as persons, as creations of God who need to know God better, and to try to present it in the way that I've always thought it should work. Here's what convinces me the most: might not work with these other people. So deep down inside, there are some people who have different levels of resistance to belief. Some people might not believe at all, and there's nothing you can say. Jesus was aware of that. If you go into a town, they don't accept it, wipe the dust off your feet. Jesus isn't saying, say good riddance to them. He's saying you did your job. You did what you could do, and you were not responsible for them making the choice not to follow. But Jesus didn't say that you shouldn't do your best to directly address their questions. So, all right. So these people are developing a faith. It's becoming something that it's not just a choice, but it's something that has life to it. What does it look like for someone to develop this faith that was kind of dead inside of them before? It was something dead that is now alive.
Well, I think it's important to remember that there's an action component to faith.
Mm-hmm.
And we're not saying fake it till you make it. So much as we're saying, look, if you want to experience faith, you're not going to experience faith if you don't experience faith. Faith makes a difference. in the way that we live. And, one of the big arguments within Protestantism is how do you reconcile Paul in Romans 4, 5, wherever he talks about Abraham. I always get that mixed up. But anyway, 4, okay. And James 2, because it seems like they're saying two different things. Paul is saying that that Abraham is justified by faith, not by works. And James is saying that Abraham is justified by works. And I actually had a conversation with a friend of mine in high school who said, we were having this debate over faith. And he said, I believe in all the parts of the Bible except the parts of James that disagree with Paul in Romans. And I'm like, as a 17-year-old, I had no clue what to do with that even.
Just tear it out of your Bible. It's easy.
I guess, or just white it out of your Bible or something. It's a very Martin Luther thing to say, James' right strawy epistle, as Luther said. Okay, but here's the thing about it. Paul and James are not saying different things. They're dealing with different issues. Okay. And what James is saying is, look, you will know someone has faith by what they do. Faith makes a difference in our lives. So we need to make sure that we are, one, living our faith. Follow Jesus, and follow Jesus most when we struggle. Okay. It's easy to be a Christian at a youth rally. It's easy to be a Christian at a youth camp. It's easy to be a Christian in the pew at church. It's harder to be a Christian when you're out in the world. Okay. When you're out of the bubble. We used to call it in school, the bubble, being in the bubble at a Christian school. Okay. Faith is something that needs to be lived. Okay. But the other thing we need to remember is, don't be afraid of the questions, because doubt builds faith. One of the most important passages in Abraham's 40-year journey is in Genesis 18. And it's not, the part I'm talking about is not the part where God comes down and says, I'm going to send you a son or give you a son. It's the part where God says, I'm going to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah. And Abraham goes, whoa, time out here. Back the divine train up. I have questions. And he asked God, this is the 50, 45, 40, 30, 20, 10. And we presented as bargaining with God. It's not, what did Abraham have to offer? I mean, he didn't have anything to offer when it comes to bargaining. But the key question there is, will not the judge of all the world do right? I don't think that Abraham would have been able to do what he did in Genesis 22 if not for the conversation and the events of Genesis 18 and 19, where he learned, yes, God is a just God. Yes, God has reasons for what he's doing. Yes, God loves man. And so when God asked Abraham, go sacrifice your son, Abraham was willing to do it because he had the experience of God being a just, an honorable God. And so he said, okay, God's just. He's not going to ask me to do something that violates his promises. So somehow this is going to work out. I don't know how, but somehow I am. And as Hebrews 11 says, he expected that God could raise someone from the dead, even though he had never seen a resurrection. And there was, like, up to that point, God hadn't raised anybody from the dead. There's no historical record of that either that we know of. So, I mean, for us, a resurrection is pretty far out there, but at least we have, historical record of God doing it. Abraham didn't have that.
Right.
This was completely inconceivable. And yet Abraham says, this is inconceivable. I've never experienced it. I have no evidence that it can happen. But God made me a promise. I know who God is. So the only way I can see God making this work is he's going to raise the boy from the dead. I don't know how that's going to work, but I trust God. And that happened because Abraham had questions, and he let those questions build his faith.
We are running up against time. We always are. And this is the end of the series. So let's have some closing statements. Jeremy, I'm wondering on this specific question, maybe how it interacts with other things that we've talked about. How can we as Christians think about this issue, and what should we be aware of?
Faith isn't knowing all the answers. It's trusting God enough to know that there are answers, that there are reasons. And you mentioned Job. That's what Job learned. As far as we know, I love this tidbit. We know what happened in Job 1 and 2 when God and Satan were talking. Nowhere does it say, and I realize I'm taking an argument from silence, so let's just say nowhere does it say, okay? I like to think that it never happened, but your mileage may vary. Nowhere does it say that God said, okay, come here, Job, I'm going to tell you the backstory. Okay, here's what happened, boom, boom, boom. And then Job said, oh, well, I repent in sackcloth and ashes. And no, God came down and he revealed himself to Job and he said, this is me. This is what I've done. This is who I am. And Job said, that's enough. That's enough. It wasn't, what Job needed wasn't the answers. It was the presence of God. Mm-hmm. And just to bring all of this back to kind of the theme we've been chasing all the way back since we started Acts chapter 2, the ultimate evidence for God is Jesus. How do you explain Jesus if there is no God? How can we wrestle with, I have questions, I don't see how God is working? That's fair. But in Jesus, God came here, and God took on the form of a man, and God subjected himself to everything that we go through, and even the idea of, I don't want to do this, but I will because I'm submitting to the Father. Even that was not beneath Jesus. If God can do that, then we can look at him and say, I don't understand, but I trust that you do.
Yeah. It's a matter of trust. That's well said. To trust in God. We've been going through Lee Strobel's Case for Faith book. And I think we mentioned this in the first lesson, we'll mention it here again. When he started doing what became the Case for Christ, his first book, he was not a believer when he started that. He started asking questions, and it led him to a place of faith. God uses questions. God uses questions just as much as he uses the evidence that answer those questions. The questions lead to evidence. Honest, sincere questioning only can lead to God. There are times when we are confused, even as Christians, about where things will lead. We might not have the answers, but we should have the confidence. We should at least know where the confidence comes from, that all of these questions, all of the pain and suffering that we have, eventually we find comfort in Jesus. We find answers in the Father. That's why the Spirit indwells us. This is kind of off topic, but I'll say one last thing because I don't want it to be unsaid. As we're thinking about having a big tent within Christianity, inviting people in who have questions, just we should acknowledge that when people come in off the street with questions, we don't put them in the pulpit the first time. They don't teach class. That's not a position of authority. The Bible tells us that elders should not be recent converts. At the same time, we should also be respectful of leaders, ministers, elders. They have questions too. Now, their questions are perhaps more mature questions. They're more nuanced questions because God has not given all knowledge just because you are a practicing minister. I think we as Christians do each other a service when we assume that other people in the congregation have questions. And we should be an open place for conversation and for those places to happen. We still concentrate on truth, but the truth is much better when it is seen through our questions, because it brings up that wonderful relationship that we have with God. All right. Jeremy, I've enjoyed having this class. Now, you teach this class, so you've done this before, but this is good for us to have this wider conversation. And I look forward to more conversations, more questions that we will have, not only us, but also Highland Heights together. So thanks to everyone who has joined us for these conversations. Thanks for joining this specific class. We are going to start a new series next Sunday. We hope that it gets cut off right in the middle because we're able to go back to Sunday morning classes. But assuming that it's not, we're going to spend several weeks going through the 10 Commandments, that ancient code given from God to man on how to live and what it means for us today. So we will begin that series next week.